thank you very much. And thank you, Berta, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you, Aborna, for having me here in your parish. It's a great honour. I take every invitation very seriously. And first time I've spoken on this topic, and when I got the topic, I thought, well, that's a really interesting one. It's also a very broad one. And how do you approach it? I mean, the question, who is God? And I was thinking, well, we live in a world firstly, we as Catholics, Maronite Catholics or Roman Catholics, Catholics in general, we take for granted that there's one God, and we purport to know who that God is. And we express that in our liturgy, in our public worship, in our private worship. We said it today in Mass. We all said the Creed, the Nicene-Constantinople Creed, which comes from the 4th century. And I just quote the first words. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty. So who is God? I can just answer the question right now very simply. It's the one God, the Father Almighty, the God of Jesus Christ. Okay, and we take that for granted, but there'll be a lot of people out there that would certainly dispute that. There are a lot of people who believe in one God, but don't want to call him Father. There are a lot of people who believe in one God, but they don't believe in Jesus Christ. And there's an increasing number of people who don't believe in any God whatsoever. Of course, there are hordes of people, when I mean hordes, billions of people who believe in a multiplicity of gods and all sorts of different religions today. Polytheistic religions, that is, many gods. Now, when you look at the Creed, let's go back back in time a little bit. Let's go back to those early centuries. The Roman Empire is still in existence, and Christianity has finally become liberated after terrible persecutions spanning 2.5 centuries. And with the freedom of the church, actually, we weren't free of troubles. Other troubles began within the church. Theological controversies, we call them heresies, different views about God, different views about Jesus Christ, etc. And so, to meet those controversies, the church was now free enough to actually gather, the bishops to gather in councils. We had an emperor, whose name was Constantine, who would actually facilitate this, even fund this, even attend these councils. And it was these councils that gave us the creed that we said in Mass today, for example, which speaks about one God, the Father Almighty. So this was controversial in the context of its time, because even though Christianity was now legal, it was not yet the official religion of the empire. Go back, it's AD 325. For Christianity to become, Catholicism in particular, to become the official religion of the Roman Empire, that won't be until AD 381. The Emperor Theodosius I. Constantine gave us freedom, and Theodosius, 55 years later, so to speak, around that number of years, decided to make Catholicism the official religion of the empire. But at that time, the majority of people in the empire were still polytheistic and worshipped all sorts of gods. So Christianity was still a minority religion. Now, the statistics vary, but I've read that even at the time of the last persecution of Christianity by Diocletian from AD 303 to AD 313, that decade, Christians were still no more than 30% of the empire, and mostly in the East. The Middle East, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor, North Africa, etc. So, to believe in one God was controversial and still a minority position. A God that was all-powerful. The infinite power that a God should have for the ancient polytheistic religions, that power was divided up between many, many gods. But then we have another statement in the Creed which reads the following: This God, the Father Almighty, was creator of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. And again, we as Christians, we take that for granted. Of course, the one God is eternal and infinite in power and created all things, everything we can see, everything in the universe and everything we can't see, the material and the spiritual realms. Is that controversial for us? No. But that was put in because of another problem that was existing and growing within the church at that time, and that was a belief system called Gnosticism. Who's heard of the term Gnosticism? Okay, right. I knew that would be the only answer. Okay. Gnosticism, from the Greek gnosis, means knowledge. And the Gnostics were people who claimed to have the secret knowledge. If you're an agnostic, the prefix a in Greek means without. So if you're an agnostic, you are without knowledge. If you're a Gnostic, you have knowledge, but what type of knowledge? A secret knowledge. Only for a select few. And for the Gnostics, they didn't believe in one God. They believed in two gods. They were dualistic. And these two gods were equal in power. And they struggled for supremacy in the universe. You know, when you look at the yin-yang symbol, you know, the circle with the line, the wavy line in the middle, and half of it's black and half of it's white. That is a Gnostic symbol. That symbolizes two equal forces seeking supremacy in the universe, and neither would ever prevail over the other. And for the Gnostics, the good God created the spiritual realm. The evil God, or the evil principle, created the material realm. And it was the great endeavour of Gnostics salvation for them was to reach a state where we're free from the material, free from our bodies. Because material things were evil, inherently evil, because they were created by the evil God, the evil principle. And so if I'm a Gnostic, and remember St. Augustine of Hippo, the great Western father, the greatest church theologian, perhaps together with St. John Chrysostom in the East, before St. Thomas Aquinas. He was a Manichaean Gnostic for 9 years. He was caught up in this religion as well. And eventually he was converted and came out of it, and we know what he became afterwards. But for the Gnostic, there isn't one God, right? And there's two gods, and one of them is evil, and that God created everything that's evil that we can see. Well, Christianity made the statement, okay, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, and that was against polytheism, and then creator of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible, that was against Gnosticism. Because the one eternal, infinite God created everything that we can see and can't see, and everything is good. Our bodies are good. And then we end with a reaffirmation of the goodness of our body at the end of the creed when we say we believe in the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. So eternal life is going to be not just us as spiritual souls in heaven looking at God, but us together, reunited body and soul in heaven. And our bodies will be the same body you've got now, but glorified, perfected. Like Christ's body when he rose from the dead was the same body he died in, but now in a new condition, glorified, that is made ready for heaven, to be in the presence of God face to face. Now, I spent a little bit of time talking about what the world was like briefly in the 4th century, Roman Empire, etc. But scholars who look at ancient civilizations and ancient religions tell us that's probably around 2,500 different gods were worshipped in the various kingdoms, pagan Gentile kingdoms, before the advent of Christianity. And I'm just going to give you a small handful, tiny handful of these gods, and some of these gods you have heard of. The sun god, the Egyptians called him Aton, and the Romans called him Solus Invictus, the invincible sun. Constantine's father believed in Solus Invictus. The sun is a god. The moon is a god. Artemis, Luna were the names of ancient moon gods. And by the way, we still live with this legacy. Monday is named after the moon god. Sunday is named after the sun god. Then we have planets which were worshipped as gods. Jupiter, that was the king of the gods for the Romans, and the Roman equivalent to Zeus. We have Saturn. The feast day for the worship of Saturn was December 25, Saturnalia, which is why Gregory the Great, in trying to evangelize Germany, was happy to put Christmas, the celebration of Jesus Christ, the birth of Jesus Christ, on that same day. Well, actually reaffirmed it, because it was all, even centuries before Gregory the Great, who's 6th century. You know, we know John Chrysostom and St. Augustine were talking about Christmas being celebrated on December 25 as well, but the feast day for in Germany, or Germania as it was then, was December 25, and it was called Saturnalia. What else do we have? Mars, of course, was a great Roman god. In the Roman calendar, the first month of the year was March, named after Mars, the god of war. Planets were worshipped. The stars were worshipped, particularly by the Babylonians. Astraeus was the god of the stars. Gods of the sea, Neptune, Poseidon. Earth deities, Gaia, the Tudigongs of China. Animals were worshipped, the Egyptians in particular. Most of their gods had animal heads. Anubis, the ibis, that horrible looking bird that goes into our garbage bins today, was worshipped in ancient Egypt as a god. Millions of them were mummified by the ancient Egyptians. We're digging them up today, mummies of ibis birds. Probably for us, if we worship God, if we worship ibis today, we'll probably have that bird as the god of garbage, because they're always coming after our garbage bins. Then we have the Egyptians worship the crocodile and the cat, especially the cat in ancient Egypt. Now, I said in the ancient world, you know, scholars tell us there's approximately 2,500 of these gods, and I've only given you a small sample. But in Hinduism today, and Hinduism is a very ancient religion, they have up to 300 million gods. And the three main ones is Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. Three of the chief gods of the Hindu pantheon. Now, if you go to Rome today, I'll be going there soon, next month. And I've been 4 times to Rome, but I've never been to this building called the Pantheon. And I hopefully go there eventually, or maybe this time. And the Pantheon, pan, meaning universe, and theon, from theo, gods, the universe of gods. So the Romans, when they conquered, even though they were highly intolerant of Christianity for 2.5 centuries, the Romans were really flexible when it came to religion. And when they conquered the territory, new territories, and they conquered the whole Mediterranean basin, Europe, Middle East, North Africa, they were very syncretistic, meaning they liked to combine the different religions and the different gods into one system. That's why they had the Pantheon, this temple in Rome, where you could turn up and worship any god you wanted to. And there were statues of all different gods. And you go to a different niche for different gods. Have you been there, Father, the Pantheon? Anyone been to the Pantheon here? Right, great. Okay, I said I've never been there. But we do have records of one Roman emperor, Alexander Severus, and he was emperor, he was a boy emperor. And he had some influence of Christianity, because the great father of the church, Origen from Alexandria in Egypt, was a tutor to a princess named Mamaea. And she married into the Severine family. And they became the Roman emperors from 192 onwards. So we had Severines who were emperors of Rome for over 4 decades, and one of them was highly influenced by Christianity, and she influenced her son Alexander, who was a teenage emperor. And Alexander Severus actually put in the Pantheon statue of Moses and the statue of Jesus Christ. So it's the first record we have of a statue of Jesus Christ anywhere in the history of the church or society, culture. It was actually created by a pagan or half-pagan Roman emperor. All right. Now, we could go on forever about all these different gods. The gods of Egypt, Sumeria, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Phoenicia, Greece, Rome, the Mesoamericans, That's the American tribal peoples before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Africa, India, China, Australasia, etc., etc. What does this tell us? Why do the records of all human civilizations tell us that they all worshipped divinities, deities, gods? Why don't we ever find in the ancient world purely atheistic societies? I mean, the Greeks were very rational. They reached high points in philosophical thinking, so much so that we still read them today. We still study them today. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, whatever. But we never find anywhere in the ancient world atheistic societies. All of them were theistic, but polytheistic. The exception were the Hebrews, the Israelites, and the remnant tribe of them, the Jews. Okay? When you read Jews in the New Testament, it's really a generic term for those who lived in Judea and those who are of other tribes who were remnant of the other 10 tribes that were despoiled by the Assyrians and etc. But Jews is, strictly speaking, one of the 12 tribes, but they were the exception. They were monotheistic. They worshipped only one God, and that God was invisible. And they had a strict code according to the commandments not to depict their own God, let alone any other gods. They could depict him in symbol, but not actually say this is what our God looks like, okay? What this tells us is that there's a natural instinct in all human beings to worship the divine. Doesn't matter who you are, what race, what religion you ultimately ended up in, what culture, what civilization, what age in history, every human being has placed in them a natural instinct to worship the divine. Who placed that in us? It was God himself. The one God that we believe in, that I'm leading up to by the end of this presentation, that God who created us, at the same time created us, inbuilt in us an instinct to worship him. So what went wrong? Why is it that this one God who we believe in, who's eternal, infinite, right, created humanity, but humanity goes astray? And hardly any members of that humanity end up worshipping this one eternal, infinite God, but goes off in all different directions. And the problem is original sin. In God's original plan that we read in Genesis, that God created our original parents, Adam and Eve, in paradise, and they knew him. They had a direct natural communication with him. They didn't see God face to face, but they walked with him and they talked with him. They communed with him. They communicated with him. Like you might communicate with someone over the phone today, it's natural, nothing special about that. They had that conversational communication with God. How did it become disconnected? Through original sin. They knew God, they knew his will, they knew his plan, they went against it deliberately. They chose to go against it. We read it in Genesis. Read it in Genesis chapter 3. And consequences flowed from that. Many, many consequences. The two that are relevant here, well, the first consequence, estrangement from God, and ignorance and malice. Put those three together. Okay, estrangement from God, that natural communication relationship we had with him is now disconnected because we turned our back on him. Ignorance in the intellect. Adam and Eve were created with infused knowledge. That is all the knowledge necessary for humanity, and they are to pass that on to their children. They are to be the only school. The only schools originally in God's plan were home schools. Okay? And it would be easy for us as parents to transmit our information to our children because we weren't wounded in the intellect. But when we're wounded in the intellect, what replaces that infused knowledge is ignorance. And ignorance is lack of knowledge that we should have. So we're estranged from God, and we're now ignorant of him, but we still have this natural instinct in us to worship the divine. And because of the estrangement and ignorance, we direct that natural instinct to creatures. when we are confronted with mysteries, we want to know the riddle of life or the answer to things, and we're looking and searching for those answers, we find those answers only in the creatures we can see. So we divinize, in our ignorance, we divinize the creatures that we can see. We don't know what stars really are. They must be some types of super beings. We call them gods. Same with the moon. The moon is greater than the stars because it's bigger and brighter. And the sun is the greatest of all the gods because it's bigger and brighter than anything else. So these mysteries that confront us, the solutions we give to those mysteries when we're in ignorance is that we deify these beings when we don't have true understanding. How does malice come into it? Malice is a technical word for excessive self-love. That's one of the greatest wounds of original sin. The distortion in us because of the sin where we're no longer worshipping God above all things. We're no longer loving our neighbour as ourselves, or we love ourselves above all things. Now, if you know Jesus, you know what he taught. One of the core teachings of Jesus in the gospel is love God with all your mind, body, heart and soul. Love your neighbour as yourself. Leave and love your enemies. Hey, that's really hard. I don't think I achieved that well, but that's what he teaches. And when you understand how original sin wounded us, and so that we're no longer loving outwardly, but loving inwardly, introverted in our love. So we love ourselves above all things. Not God, not our neighbour. Right? This is malice. This is the implosion of love. So when we are estranged from God, when we're in ignorance and we have excessive self-love, is it any wonder that we end up deifying ourselves? Making gods of ourselves. And that's we see that throughout the whole of human history. All these great civilizations that archaeologists dig up and our history books write about and that we learn about and that we admire. And one of my hobbies, I hardly watch any TV. Right? But when I do watch TV, lying on my back on the sofa in the TV room, I'm watching History Channel. I love to watch about Roman history or Greek history or any other ancient history, or all history really. But what's common in the study of all ancient civilizations is that they deified human beings. They made gods of human beings, especially the powerful ones. The pharaohs were gods. How else could they get hundreds of thousands of people to build piles of rock in the desert for their tombs? Who else is going to do that? Unless you're a god and you commanded and people believed it, that they were gods. The Roman emperors gradually, the emperor cult came into the world roughly the same time as when Jesus Christ came into the world. Because Augustus Caesar becomes emperor, or he's not called emperor in 31 BC, but gradually first citizen, father of the empire, 31 BC, 27 BC, and after he dies, the Senate votes him to be divine, one of the gods. Same with his successor Tiberius. Now, Jesus is born in the reign of Augustus Caesar. So the true God-man comes into the world at the same time the emperor cult has begun in the Roman Empire. And when Jesus grows up and he becomes a man and he's preaching and does everything he does that we believe in, it's recorded in the Gospels, that's in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, who ends up he dies in AD 37, not long after Jesus is crucified and rises from the dead. And he's deified by the Senate as well. Then we have Caligula, AD 37 to 41. And Caligula was very young, he was 24 when he became emperor. And his first 6 months as emperor was fine, great, people loved him. Oh, what a relief from the tyranny of Tiberius. But then he went berserk. And he became the most monstrous sexual pervert, murderer, sadist, and persecutor of anyone with power and authority in Rome, and the Romans sent until they bumped him off 4 years later. But he went one step further than the previous two emperors. He had himself deified while he was still alive. He had contempt for the Roman Senate. I don't need the Roman Senate to make me a god. I make myself a god. I'm God. Okay? And if you didn't worship him, you're in big trouble. Okay, and then we saw Other kingdoms, Chinese emperors, Japanese emperors, Inca emperors, Dalai Lamas, all divine, given divine status, worshipped as gods on earth. Others were made divine posthumously, as I said already. A couple of Roman emperors, Romulus and Remus, the two twins who are said to have founded Rome in 753 BC. If you're into mathematics, Pythagoras was made a god after he died. Alexander the Great was made a god. And his body was entombed in a shrine called the Soma in Alexandria. And it was there for centuries. I think, we don't know for sure, but we highly suspect that it was the Christians who stole his body and destroyed it. Because Egypt, Alexandria, had become a great centre of Christianity by the 4th century AD. And the Christians, when they gained the ascendancy, became very intolerant of paganism, which is why it became eventually superseded officially in Roman law. And I agree with that move, okay? Now we're heading the other direction. And then we had Antinous. Now, who's Antinous? Who knows anyone about Antinous? Well, actually, he was the... I better be careful here because there's young people in the room. Hadrian was the emperor of Rome after... Then we have Trajan, 98 to 117, Hadrian, 117 to 138. And he was homosexual. And he had an attraction to young boys. And one of them was Antinous. And Antinous drowned in an accident when he was an elderly teenager. And Hadrian was so distressed, he got the Senate to deify him, to make him a god. One famous figure in the ancient world who had a great impact on the people of God in the 2nd century BC is Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And he was the Seleucid king, the king of the Syrian kingdom. This is in the post-Alexandria, the Great era. You had the Seleucid kingdom, which was Syria, Phoenicia, Asia Minor. And they tried to move south and conquer Judea, to take that territory off the Ptolemies in Egypt, and they succeeded. And when they succeeded, Antiochus Epiphanes, it went to his head. He made himself a god. When he called himself Epiphanes, he's the manifestation of the divine in the world. And then he sought to outlaw Judaism, outlaw circumcision, force the Jews to eat pork. He took over the temple in Jerusalem. He put a statue of Zeus in the temple, and then the Maccabean Wars broke out, and the Jews were successful in those wars against all the odds. Quite incredible, right? To defeat the Seleucids. But Antiochus is one of those figures that, again, deified himself, human pride, and impacted on the people of God. And same with Nero. No exception. Okay, then we have some people who have made gods against their will. We read in the Acts of the Apostles when St. Paul and St. Barnabas on their first missionary journey in Asia Minor, Turkey, and now in the Lycaonian district around the cities of Lystra and Derbe, right? That when they were seen doing miracles, the locals flipped. Oh, they must be gods. And they called St. Barnabas Jupiter, and they called Paul Mercury. And then they brought out all the bulls to do sacrifice. And St. Paul and St. Barnabas ripped their clothes and said, no, you can't do this. This is why we're here. We're here to teach you against this folly. We're here to teach you about the true God and to turn you away from these false gods that dominated the world. You know, what a job, really. Just stop there for a moment. Just think about it. When our Lord was on earth and he commissioned these 12 men go to baptize all nations, we read it, we say, yeah, good, they succeeded. Hey, but hold on. They're up against it. The whole world was in the darkness. That's why when you read in the Gospels and Jesus says, I'm the light of the world, he really was. Because the world was in incredible darkness, in the slavery of these false gods, all these deities, including human deities who were oppressive and murderous, etc. Now this hasn't stopped even in modern times. When we come to the 20th century, we see self-deification manifest itself in political realms, in a political manner. So we see these horrible totalitarian leaders, glorious leaders, so to speak, who become virtual gods. And we saw it with Adolf Hitler. We saw it with Vladimir Lenin. We saw it more so with Joseph Stalin, and more so again with Chairman Mao. And we see it with we saw it with Pol Pot. And you see it now. Chairman Xi in China is trying to be the new Chairman Mao, where they're actually atheists, these people, but they want a supremacy, and they want a reverence, and they want an adulation akin to divinity. When you see what happened in Germany, such a great people, such an intelligent people, such an advanced culture, okay, and how it fell into Hitlerism, and how Hitler basically took over every aspect of the Nazi Party, took over every aspect of life in Germany. It was a cult. That's the best word to describe it. The cult of Hitler. Same in the Soviet Union, the cult of Stalin. In China, the cult of Mao. And instead of reading the scriptures and the words of Christ, we'll read Mein Kampf, or we'll read Chairman Mao's little red book. And even though we don't officially call them gods, we actually put them on pedestals as if they were. Now, in the midst of all these gods, we come back to the original question, well, who is God? I'll just go off on a little sidelight here. A little bit of a joke. There are some people who still teach out there, and I've had this issue at work even, who believe that Jesus didn't know he was God. Right? Yeah, they say he is God, or he was God, or he is God, but he didn't know it. We only knew it at a certain time. And the joke is that, well, if I was God, I think I'll know it. How could Jesus be God and not know he was God? Okay? Yeah, well, I'm glad you're laughing because it's insane. But this is taught, and this is taught in academic circles, and this is taught in seminaries, and I know people who still believe this. And when I say, of course he knew he was God. He was one person, the divine person with the divine intellect. Of course he knew he was God. And the converse to that is that I know I'm not. Okay? I know I am not God. So who is God? Who is the true God? Now, one thing about all these gods that we've already gone through the ancient world, one thing they all had in common is they all had human-like limitations and faults. Okay, when you read all the Greek mythology, Roman history, you read about their gods and their relationships and their interactions, they all had all the faults of human beings. Pride, lust, greed, domination, violence, murder, and it's normal. And of course this is the case, because these gods were created by human beings. Therefore they reflect human beings. They're just more powerful and they're up there in the clouds. Okay? It's interesting, another sidelight, Christians were called atheists because they were without the gods. They didn't worship these gods. They worshipped someone else, but that wasn't counted to their credit. But anyway, these were gods made by men who were actually made by God, the true God. So, when did light start appearing in the ancient world to deliver humanity from the darkness and the ignorance and the superstitions of these multiple gods? Well, we know with the Hebrews, and we know formally from the time of Abraham onwards, through the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? And then we had, the time in Egypt, and then we had Moses, and then we had Joshua, and then we had the judges, and then we had the kings, David, Solomon, Saul, David, Solomon, and right through then we had the prophets, etc. And then eventually we came to Jesus Christ. Of course, we know for thousands of years that they only worshipped one God, who was invisible. But there were some in the ancient world who didn't know the Jews, or at least weren't Jews or Hebrews or Israelites, and might have encountered Old Testament scriptures like Plato did go to Egypt. Okay, so he might have come across, maybe not, probably not, but some say he did encounter copies of the Old Testament in Egypt, translated into Greek, though that's speculative, right? Aristotle might have heard of the Jews and some of their beliefs, but the Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were Greek philosophers who began through reason, thinking things through, not through revelation, not through reading scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, but, coming to conclusions that all these pantheon of ancient gods was really folly, nonsense. And that if there is a God, that God must have certain characteristics to qualify as a God. And again, this was done through the light of reason. Some church fathers in early Christianity, like St. Justin Martyr, in his writings, and he's writing to the Roman authorities, the emperors, the co-emperors, the Roman Senate, Roman philosophers, and he was saying that you guys actually had truth before Jesus Christ came into the world. And he said you had seeds of truth. He used the term in Greek, logos spermatikos. You had germinating words of truth that this Jesus we believe in, before he became man, was planting seeds of truth among you peoples as a preparation for the coming of the gospel, for the preparation for you people to ultimately believe in the one true God, Jesus Christ. Now, Socrates and Aristotle, we know for sure, reason to believe in only one God in the end. In fact, Socrates is put to death for this. The famous painting of Socrates, about to drink the poison hemlock, and pointing his finger up in the air, asserting the truth before, as a martyr for truth. He's put to death for corrupting the youth. And how did he corrupt the youth? Because he was telling them all these gods you believe in, the gods of Homer and Hesiod and whatever ever since, Zeus and Aphrodite and Poseidon, they don't exist. They're figments of our imagination. And he was accused of corrupting the youth and put to death as a consequence. Now, Plato, and that's why Aristotle was a big fan of Socrates, and why Socrates is a superstar in the ancient Greek philosophical tradition. When I've read everything St. Justin Martyr ever wrote, and I noticed that he never mentioned Aristotle once, but it's Socrates he kept mentioning as the superstar philosopher of the ancient world. Plato rejected the portrayed behaviour of the gods. When he read Greek mythology and how the Greek gods behaved, he said, this is nonsense. If there is a God, they wouldn't behave like this. Okay? And again, it's incompatible with the concept of a God. Now, I can understand why today, the scary thing about today is that atheism and the new atheist movement, new atheism is distinct from atheism because atheism is a very philosophical movement. And normally, it goes back centuries and it's grown over centuries, but normally the atheists were scholars, academics, and rather gentlemanly in their debates, in their discourse, and then it became ugly. And forces like communism assumed it, and they brutalised humanity, anyone who believed in God, and killed tens of millions as a consequence. But new atheists are distinct from atheists because new atheists are vile in their behaviour. They deliberately go out of their way to insult, to ridicule. And this is dangerous because they are going to university campuses and they are reaching out to young people and they're shaming and embarrassing young people out of theistic belief, out of belief in God. The last thing young people want to be is to be embarrassed and seen to be in a minority position. They will go with the flow. And that's why every generation currently, especially since the mid-60s, and the stats in Australia, the ABS statistics show this, every succeeding generation is more atheist after another. And when you read the works of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, they're particularly vitriolic and mocking in the extreme. And they actually say, go out of your way. Don't have respect for religion and religious people. Go out of your way to mock them and ridicule them. Anyway, but I can understand why these movements, it's intellectually easy for them to look at these gods and just mock them. And then they say, well, look, there's only a small difference between us as atheists / new atheists and Christians. Christians reject 2,499 of the ancient gods, while we reject 2,500 of them. We just go that one step further. But is this really a true, authentic, or valid portrayal of the debate? Is it really simply between atheism and polytheism? Or is it really between three contestants? Atheism / new atheism, polytheism, which is still predominant in the world, and monotheism. That's really where the debate is. It's three competing forces. Now, we're still trying to answer the question, well, who is God? And how do we answer that? Because the atheists are asking the question, not who is God, but is there a God? So really, before we answer the question, who is God, we have to really grapple with the question, is there a God? And when we come to the affirmative, yes, there is a God, well, who is that God? Who is that singular God that we're meant to worship? Is it any of these polytheistic gods? What about the monotheistic religions? There's Christianity, there's Islam, there's Judaism. They have commonalities, but they have stark differences. So, am I supposed to, okay, if I come to believe in one God, which path should I go down? I mean, is it the God of Muhammad, or the God of Moses, or the God of Jesus of Nazareth? These are still questions that have to be grappled with. So even when we answer the question, is there a God? We have to answer the question, who is God? Then we have to go through another series of questions as to which is ultimately the true religion. So really, it's a long process, and it's not that easy. But let's go firstly with grappling with the idea whether there is a God or not, and how we should do it. And I'm going to be very basic here. When I used to work in university chaplaincy, I once saw an Asian lady at UNSW who was in the middle of the main walkway where thousands of students come up and forth every day, probably tens of thousands of students. And she was very adventurous, and she was probably some type of Protestant fundamentalist. And she had a Bible in her hand, and she was one hand, and her finger was pointing to a verse at that Bible. And she was just putting it in the face of anyone who was coming by who would stop for a moment. And what she was trying to do, she was obviously trying to convince people that there is a God and Jesus Christ is the Son of God and you need to believe in him to be saved. And I'm not criticizing that. But is that the first approach one should have on a university campus? Where really it's a very secular environment and everyone's intelligent, I'm not saying they're wise, but they're intelligent. And, is that the starting point for an atheist? No, it's like someone of the Islamic faith coming up to me and pointing to a verse in the Quran expecting me to believe in Muhammad straight away. I'm not going to do that. With atheists, you have to use reasonable arguments. You quote the Bible eventually, but the starting point, you have to use arguments from reason. And that's what the ancient Greek philosophers did. And that's what Christian philosophers would do as well. As I've already mentioned, Justin Martyr. He was a philosopher who became a Christian, and in his writings he used philosophical terminology to dialogue with his audience. And the Christian tradition has always adopted this. So we first see, what are we talking about here? Are natural, reasoned arguments for the existence of God. Not relying on the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, not relying on any religious text, just relying on reasonable arguments. And these reasonable arguments were first developed by ancient pagan Greek philosophers. As I said, I already mentioned Aristotle. He used this term. He taught that God is the first cause, the unmoved mover. Now, it's probably a little strange to you to hear these terms for the first time. But first cause means he is the origin of everything that exists. And if he's the first mover, he's the origin of everything that moves, that develops, that grows, that changes. While he is uncaused and unmoved, because nothing could cause him and nothing could move him. So if there is a God, who really is a God, who is supposed to have the attributes of being infinite and eternal, he couldn't be created by anyone else. He couldn't be moved by anyone else. He has to be the first cause and the first mover. Now, this type of language would be introduced into the church and adopted by the great Christian thinkers, the theologians and philosophers, and climaxing in the High Middle Ages with St. Thomas Aquinas. He's replete with quotations from Aristotle. In fact, he doesn't even call him Aristotle. He just calls him the philosopher. That was the reverence St. Thomas Aquinas had for Aristotle. He was the philosopher, and the philosopher said this. Because when you read Aristotle, you read Plato, you read Socrates, you'll find many things which contradict Christianity. Absolutely. But the reality is, there's a lot of truth there, just mixed with error. Christianity will come and baptize these philosophical writings and purge them of the error. And so we get in the High Middle Ages, which modern culture calls the Dark Ages, quite the opposite. If there are Dark Ages, they're now. We're living in them now. Right? But in the High Middle Ages, this great synthesis of philosophy and theology reached its high point with St. Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic theologians. So, for St. Thomas now, the God he believed in had to be the first mover of all things, who was unmoved. The first cause of all things, who was uncaused. So when you hear the question, who made God? Of course, the answer to that is God is uncaused. If God was made, he wouldn't be God. The being that made him would be superior, would pre-exist him, and would have qualifications to be God ahead of the God who is made. So to be a God, you can't be made. You can't have a beginning. You can't have a starting point. You can't be caused. Okay? You can't be moved. So the God of Aristotle and the God of St. Thomas is the first cause who's uncaused, the first mover who's unmoved, and is necessary being, not contingent. Now, these are technical words. I remember when I first studied this, I'm sitting in the room at night thinking, oh God, this is another language. Necessary means a being that has to exist. That's not contingent, that is not dependent on anyone else. You see, I'm not necessary. I'm going to disappear one day, only a few people will notice, and the rest of the world will go on. And I didn't exist before 21st of May 1964. I didn't exist in 1962. I'm contingent, I'm dependent on my parents, who were contingent on their parents. But so, with all beings that exist, I mean, we know even in the universe, planets disappear, stars explode, galaxies merge into other galaxies, even black holes evaporate. We know that. Stephen Hawking tells us that, right? Called Hawking radiation. Black holes will eventually evaporate and disappear. So everything changes, everything moves. Everything will ultimately disappear because they're all contingent. They're not necessary. But if there is a God, that God has to be necessary. And the cause of all things and not depend on any other being. The infinite, and this God of St. Thomas has to be the infinitely perfect being who's the source of all perfections that exist in the universe. So everything that exists, and this is again striking a blow at Gnosticism, everything that exists is good because everything that exists has perfections that in one way or another reflect the infinite perfections that exist in God. Whatever perfections exist in the universe, they simply originate in the one true God who has infinite perfections, and each of those infinite perfections to an infinite degree. There can't be any limit in this God. If that God is truly a God, it can't have any limits whatsoever. So, okay. And the source and sustainer of all order, leading all other beings towards their intended goal. So, this God, who's eternal, infinite, first cause, first mover, necessary, okay, and the source of all perfections, cannot change. If this God possesses all imperfections to an infinite degree, God doesn't change. God doesn't move. God can't lose or gain perfections. God can't gain new knowledge. Oh yeah, I'm God, but I don't know. But when I turn 15, I realise I am God. It doesn't happen. Okay? God can't move, doesn't change, because he possesses infinite perfection to an infinite degree. Can't add or lose perfections. And is present to every creature, sustaining every creature in the universe, every microbe, every atom, God is present to, sustaining them. If God disappeared now, which he can't, but if he did, everything else disappears. Because everything else is contingent on him. If there is a God, he must, according to reason, have the following attributes. Otherwise, he'll be no true God at all. As I said already, eternal, uncreated by any other being. Infinite without limit, possessing infinite perfections, each to an infinite degree. Ubiquitous, meaning being present everywhere to everything. Omnipotent, meaning possessing infinite power without any limit. Omniscient, meaning knowing all things past, present and future, and the infinite array of possibilities. So God knows not only everything that ever happened, but he knows what would have happened if Adolf Hitler in 1918 actually died of the gas attack that he suffered from. When World War I ended, Hitler was in hospital recovering. He'd been temporarily blinded and he was recovering from a gas attack. Now, if he had died from that gas attack, how different the history of the 20th century would have been. God knows how different it would have been. So God knows the infinite array of possibilities. Okay, what else? God must be immutable, cannot change, add or lose perfections, cannot suffer. That's why Jesus took a body. That's why Jesus had a body. That's why the second person of the Blessed Trinity, the Word of God, in order to suffer for human sin, had to have a body. Because God in his divine person can't suffer. But he assumes and owns a human body, and therefore that suffering in his human body is owned by God, which is why that suffering can be of infinite value and meritorious to atone for human sin. Okay, God must also be necessary, not contingent, or dependent on any other being for existence. God is also omnibenevolent, being all good, merciful, and just. Now, I threw that in because the new atheist propaganda, if you type in now, Google search, God moral monster, you get a whole series of literature now out there trying to depict the Judeo-Christian God as really an evil God. Right? And therefore, if it's an evil God, it must be a human invention. Right? And they have their arguments for that, etc. What they don't really want to admit is whatever evil exists in the world, in the universe, it's not because God ordains it, but because God permits it. Because he created human beings with free will, and he allows human beings to be human, to be free. And being free means we can make choices, good or bad, right or wrong, including evil choices. And why does a good God allow evil choices and evil to occur? For the certainty of taking a greater good from it, even though we can't measure or see that necessarily. That's a philosophical understanding of God, goodness, and the existence of evil. Okay, the God of monotheists, Christians, Jews, and Muslims is believed to be all these things I've just mentioned, and many more things. Okay, so through reason, we can argue that, and science is confirming this now. Cutting-edge science today is saying that the universe is not eternal. The universe has not always existed. Back in the 1920s, 100 years ago exactly, the predominant science was, with regards to the universe, the existence of the universe, is that the universe was eternal, uncreated, always existed. And that was the predominant view of someone like Professor Fred Hoyle. And then this priest in Belgium, Catholic priest, named Monsignor George Lemaitre, who was very intelligent in the area of science, astrophysics especially, came to, in his studies, realised that the universe is actually changing and moving and expanding from a certain point. And if we reverse engineer that expansion, we actually come back to what's called a singularity. At one point, the entire universe was a single point. Actually, scientists today tell us that everything in the universe was contained in a primeval atom, a singularity, 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter in diameter. That's incomprehensible. The whole universe was compressed in that singularity. And that it moved. It had a beginning. The scientists tell us today our universe is not eternal. It had a beginning. Why did it have a beginning? Why did it exist at all, this primeval atom? What moved it? What caused the movement? Right? So basically, science is telling us something similar to what the book of Genesis says. In the beginning, there was a beginning. Fred Hoyle mocked and laughed at Lemaitre and said, what's this Big Bang theory? The term Big Bang was originated by Fred Hoyle to mock Monsignor George Lemaitre, Catholic priest. He's trying to insert God into science. Well, he wasn't trying to do that. He was just recognizing God's place, that God is the author of the universe, created the singularity, caused the first movement, right, and caused all things that flow from that. All the evolutionary processes we see naturally in the universe, that we still see today, are caused by God. So these are, you notice I'm not really quoting the Bible here. I'm looking at science, I'm using reason, that there must have been a cause for that singularity and that expansion we call Big Bang, right? There must have been a cause. What is that cause? Science doesn't know the cause, and furthermore, can't ever know. We're still learning about the universe more and more every day with the James Webb Space Telescope has given us new information that's rattling the original Big Bang theory. Not cancelling it out altogether, but giving us new data because we're still learning. But one thing we'll never know is what caused the first movement in the universe, but we know it from faith to revelation, God, who's the uncaused cause. Now we're going to move on. Well, which God is the true God among the monotheists? I'm looking at the time, so I won't take much more now, but I'm going to go through a 100-meter sprint here. Now, each one of these dot points are really a talk in their own right, but I'm going to just show you the process now. If we reason to the existence of one God who's eternal, who's infinite, all-powerful, all that, well, which is it of the monotheist religions? I mean, we've got three candidates out there. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the chief monotheistic religions, chronologically speaking. Okay? Well, has this one God, if he does exist, revealed himself? Well, we believe he has. We formally look at the next phase of that revelation from Abraham onwards. So roughly 21st century BC, roughly just over 4,000 years ago. And if we continue to study, or what records we do have, is that this revelation continues over the centuries through his son Isaac, and then Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob, and then Joseph in Egypt, and then the captivity in Egypt. Now we're moving to roughly the 15th, 14th, 13th century BC. Okay, that captivity is 430 years. Then we come to Moses, and then we come to the Exodus, and then we come into Joshua. We have records of the Israelites, these people in the Sinai. We know under Joshua they penetrate into Canaan. We notice now we're talking about the 12th, 13th century BC. We know at the period of the Judges, we have records of who they are, right? And we know about the records of all these manifestations, which we call miracles, that delivered the Hebrews from Egypt through the Red Sea, through Sinai, the manna, the water, the quails, right? And then we see the presence of God among the Israelites there in the tabernacle as a cloud and fire. And then we have the advent of the kings. We have the building of the first temple. We have God making himself present, seen among the Israelites in the first temple at the opening inauguration ceremony. And then we have the slow apostasy of the Hebrews. And then we have the prophets sent who did miracles. Now, miracles are a great apologetical method, a technique to show that there is a God. The best the atheists can do when confronted with miracles is just to put philosophical barriers up against them. Okay, why is God so capricious? Why does he only do miracles very rarely if he does at all? You know, but really, what we got to do is we got to look at each claimed miracle one by one and test it scientifically and medically. And it's overwhelming. We do have hundreds, if not thousands, of attested miracles that science affirm and tell us that there's no natural explanation. Whether it be the miracles of Lourdes since 1858, roughly 70 approved canonical miracles, thousands of others, Eucharistic miracles by the hundreds, incorrupt bodies. We have another incorrupt body of an American nun revealed just a few weeks ago. She's been dead for 4 years and her body is still incorrupt. We have the incorrupt body of Carlo Acutis, who died in 2005, a 15-year-old teenager who died of leukemia. His body now is in Assisi. He's still dressed in his jeans and his t-shirt. He was a techno nerd. He created a website on Eucharistic miracles. So he taught about miracles, and now his body is a living miracle. Incorrupt there in Assisi. I'll see it in a few weeks. I'm looking forward to it. Okay? So miracles galore are evidence supported by science and medicine that there is a God. Why are these miracles happening predominantly in one religion? Right? Christianity and Catholicism most specifically. Right? That's the pathway we need to go. So then we go ultimately to, in this journey throughout the Hebrews, Israelites, Judaism, etc., we come to Jesus of Nazareth, and we have the historical record of him. And people can argue whether Jesus really existed or not. And all these pseudo-historians out there saying Abraham never existed, Moses never existed, the Exodus never happened, Jesus really didn't exist. This is mythicism. This is the movement called mythicism, which is the next wave post-New Atheism. Mythicism, all these characters really didn't exist. But hold on, if they didn't exist, where did the movement come from? If Jesus Christ didn't exist, where did his movement, who started his movement? There's no alternative historical record except what we have in the Gospels. Okay? Anyway, now this is very wide territory, just outlining the process. So we looked at natural apologetics, which is concerned with arguments for proving the existence of God. Then we go to Christian apologetics, which is arguments in favour of the Christian religion over other monotheistic religions. That is, asserting the claims of Jesus of Nazareth over Judaism, that he is the Son of God, right? That he is the Messiah, okay? And that he did die and rise from the dead, and that he did teach about a one God who was a trinity of persons, etc. That's Christian apologetics over and above the claims of Judaism and Islam. Okay, because Judaism outrightly rejects Jesus as anyone special, while Islam said, well, Jesus is special, but just a prophet. He didn't die on the cross, and he didn't rise from the dead. Okay, they're two very important distinctions between us and Islam, right? And we need an apologetic to address that. So we move from asserting the existence of one God, then we have to assert the truth of which one God of the three monotheistic religions is the actual, the God who's revealed himself throughout human history, and that climaxes in Jesus of Nazareth. And then we have to assert the claims of Jesus of Nazareth to be the Messiah, the Son of God, who died, rose from the dead, etc. And then we go to the next realm of Catholic apologetics. And there the audience we address is not Islam or Judaism, but other people who believe in the one God, who believe in the Trinity, who believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, who believe that he died and rose from the dead, as we do, but they don't believe in Catholic distinctives like the papacy or the Mass or the Eucharist, the real presence, the seven sacraments, the four dogmas of Mary, and a host of other beliefs. And that's a process we have to come through. That's a process that I've come through. That's a process that I believe in. That's the process that I promote, because I didn't invent that. That's the classic Catholic apologetic books tells us. This is the process we have to go through, starting with, is there a God? Who is that God? What is the true, who is the greatest prophet of that God? And what is the true religion of that God? All right. Now, in conclusion, I just state this. We have been graced to know that there is a God, and who that God is, And which of the three monotheistic religions, from all the evidence we have now, I haven't gone into all the evidence, that takes years to do that. So I'm presuming it being Christianity, and which of those Christianities is possesses the fullness of the truth and the fullness of the means of salvation, and that's the Catholic faith. So I can say amen to that because that's a grace, and you have been given that grace, and you need to appreciate that grace much more every day in your lives. And I just have a last question here. Is the God of the Jews, Christians and Muslims the same God? And the answer to that question is yes and no. So I really made it certain, didn't I? Yes, because we all believe that our God is the God of Abraham. So from that perspective, yes, the God of the Jews, Christians and Muslims is the same God. But from other finer points and perspectives, the answer is no. Because it's controversial to say that, but let's put it more subtly, more carefully. We do believe in the same God, but we believe different things about the same God. Like the Christian God is a Trinity. Judaism doesn't accept that, neither does Islam. The Christian God is proximate, intimate, immanent, among us. Islam doesn't believe that. The Islamic God is remote, transcendent, above us, not so intimate. Right? We believe that God became man. Judaism did not foresee such a Messiah. Islam rejects such a belief. So yes, we do believe in the same God, but we believe in different things about that same God. Okay, I'll leave it there. Happy to take any questions. We don't want to be too long. Thank you for your time. I hope you found that enriching somewhat and informative. Thanks very much. God bless.
Does anybody have any questions for me? I can't remember my kids' names. I can't remember their date of births. I get overwhelmed with Robert, the dates and the numbers and all that. Wow! But so much from that, talking about history and about coming to who is God and understanding that, in those times they had all these different diverse beliefs. I had no idea about that. I'm constantly in awe when you speak, Robert. And my brain sometimes fizzles, I think, a little bit too. I don't know about anybody else. But does anybody have any questions about God to Robert? Maybe if you want to explore about the Trinity God and that aspect of it.
It's not a question, more of a statement. But I think the biggest grapple, I don't know if anyone else feels this, and the grace of faith helps. But when you think about, I know that no one caused God, no one began God, but it's very hard, I think, for everyone to get their minds around the beginning of God. Like say the world was all black, and then there was God. But I know you answered it by saying he didn't come from anywhere, but it's just that thought of
nothing was black.
Okay.
To say that everything was black and then there was God, is that how you put it?
Yeah.
Right. Let's put it this way. There was always God. God is. And before creation, there's only God. There wasn't even blackness. There wasn't even empty space. Okay? Nothing that we know scientifically that we can observe in the universe, including the emptiness of space, existed. It was just God. And what did God do before he created? God does not exist in time. He exists in eternity, which is a different concept altogether. Time was created with the universe. That's what the scientists say. Before creation, before the first movement of the singularity we call the first bang, there was no time. That's what science says. So God's outside of time. God is in eternity. And what was God doing in eternity? Getting bored, waiting for something, reading old books? No, that's not what God was doing. God was simply knowing and loving himself. That's the Trinity. God the Father knows himself. That's the beginning of the Son, intellectual procession. The icon of the Father is the Son. And the Father beholding the Son, and the Son beholding the Father, that mutual knowledge between the Father and the Son breeds, and that's it, an eternal, infinite mutual knowledge breeds simultaneously an eternal and infinite mutual love. That's the Holy Spirit. So that's why God has to be Trinity, because that's what God is, and that's what God is doing from all eternity. And it's just a constant. It's the eternal now of God knowing and loving himself. So there was God and nothing else. Not empty space, not darkness. Empty space and darkness can only exist when creation begins. So why does God create? It's a mystery. The answer we have is that God created out of an overflow of his love, so that creatures can know him and participate in his life and share his life. That's the best answer we have. You know? So. But see, if it's hard to grapple with the idea of God's eternity, many people who are atheists or whatever, they don't have that same difficulty in accepting the eternity of the universe. Even though science tells us now that our universe is not eternal. So what they say, they move to multiverse theory. So our universe is just one bubble of an infinite array of universes. And the infinite array, in one form or another, is eternal. But our little bubble began in time or will end in time. This is multiverse theory. And you need more faith for multiverse theory than you do for belief in God. I would say, and I'm sure many scientists, if any scientists saw this video, they'd laugh at it, but there's no hardcore evidence for multiverse. That is multiple universes besides this one. And we not only know that this universe had a beginning, but that this universe has a limit in size. Though it is expanding at a speed faster than the speed of light, right? And it's now approximately 93 billion light years in diameter and growing faster every second, it's still limited in size. And that's philosophically what we would expect from a Christian theological, philosophical perspective, because only God is infinite. No, I used to think when I was growing up, the universe is infinite. No, it's not. And who says that? The scientists. They say the universe has a limit. And I'm not surprised at that. I rejoice in that discovery because it's a creature, therefore must have a limit. No creature can be eternal. No creature can be infinite. The universe now, the scientists tell us, is not eternal and not infinite. Only God is eternal and infinite.
Anybody have any more questions or comments they want to make? I just want to touch on quickly that, Robert, you mentioned that our faith and our God is, we have an intimate relationship with him. That's what defines or separates it from the other faiths. And I think it's really important for us to know that, and our future talks with the Faith Formation talks about how we can further develop our personal relationship with God and how we can build that relationship. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Why does God want that, like our God? Is it,
well,
you know?
We know he wants that because of the way he created us. He created us with an intellect and a will, and that's to know, understand, and judge, and to love. So what's the point of having these powers unless they have an end? You know, what we call a telos in Greek, an end, has a purpose. So the purpose of these powers, to know things, to understand things, and then to make judgments, and then to love or to hate, okay? And that goes all the way, that must go all the way to, with respect to every being and the ultimate being who is God. So we are made to know, understand, and love God. And since we're made for that, we should be doing that. Now, I hope I didn't say that the other religions don't have or don't teach that we are to have a relationship with God. I would say they do. Obviously, Judaism and Islam do. What I was trying to say is that with Christianity, that is reciprocal. We don't just bow down and worship God slavishly. God actually comes down to us and it's intimate. This is the distinction between Christianity and Judaism and Islam. God actually has reached down to us, and we saw it in the Old Testament, the cloud and the fire. In the days of the tabernacle, in the days of the first temple, we had the presence of God. Now they called it the Shekinah, which is the indwelling, kavod, glory, the indwelling of the glory of God, as a cloud by day and fire by night. And the cloud was called an Ananai. Ananai HaKavod, the cloud of glory. It's the same cloud when Jesus ascended into heaven. He ascended on the cloud. That's not a normal cloud. It's not what they call in Greek the nephos. It is a nephos is a normal cloud. Jesus ascended into heaven on the Ananai, the cloud of glory. That's a manifestation of God in that form. Now, God has always shown that he wants to be intimate among his people. In the garden, when Adam and Eve walked and talked with them, they could hear God walking. Might be figurative language because God doesn't have feet, but they could feel and have a sense of his presence among them in the garden. As I said, lost by original sin. But after that, God still wants to be intimate and reach out and be among his people, like a campfire. Okay? And that ultimate expression is in Jesus Christ. God becomes human. God takes on human flesh, becomes man, walks, tabernacles among us, as St. John says at the beginning of his gospel. And it continues more so today in the Eucharist, because that's Jesus Christ present to us, not under the form of cloud or fire, but under the forms of bread and wine. And the intimacy is even greater than it was, even in the days of, you can say, even in the days when Jesus walked the earth, the intimacy Christ has with us now is greater because he is present in every church, not just there walking around Judea and Samaria and Syria and Lebanon, etc., but actually in every tabernacle of every church and comes to us as spiritual food. You can't get more intimate than that. The Eucharist, Christ, his sacred body, precious blood, soul and divinity, God and man in this form coming to us as spiritual food. Now that's intimate. That doesn't exist outside of Christianity. It only exists in Catholicism and in the Eastern Orthodox traditions that retain the sacraments and the Mass and the Eucharist. Doesn't exist in Judaism, doesn't exist in Islam, and doesn't exist in Protestantism, sadly, because they rejected it from the 16th century onwards. The only Protestants who claim to have that would be High Anglicans. They claim to have it, but whether they have a priesthood, a valid priesthood or not, the answer is probably not. Some might, but most wouldn't. But anyway, so intimacy is important, and we've got to realise this. Hey, our churches are empty. Not our Maronite churches, we're still doing better than the average. But around the world, it's collapsing. In Australia, it's 9%. In many European countries, it's 1 to 2%. In the United States, it's collapsing. Just 10 years ago, it was 25, 26%. Now it's 17%. Only 30% of Americans believe in the Eucharist and the real presence. What's going on? We've failed. We're destroying ourselves through bad teaching, bad catechesis, through bad example. So we've got to turn this around. Where do we turn it around? Here now, with us. Doing a group like this. In yourself, change, turn around. In your family, change around. In the parish, change around. We can turn it around. And God wants to still be among his people. We had a Eucharistic miracle recently in the United States where the priests ran out of hosts and the hosts kept multiplying. In a parish in America, I can't remember exactly where, but it was only about 3 or 4 months ago. And they're investigating this at the moment. That's Christ, that's God telling us he wants to still be among us and feed his people. Same miracle happened to St. John Bosco back in Italy in the 19th century. Miracles are still happening. We're Maronites. We know about St. Charbel MacLuth. He's the greatest miracle worker of the last 125 years in the history of the church. I think there's only one other saint in the history of the church that did more miracles than St. Charbel, and that's St. Vincent Ferrer. In the 14th and 15th centuries, he did 58,000 miracles. St. Charbel's at 23,000, but he's closing quick, all right? And he does, when St. Charbel's does a miracle, wow. Some of these miracle accounts that I read, whether in Lebanon or in other countries, like I've read a few in a magazine in 2016, 2017, some miracles of St. Charbel in the United States. Unbelievable miracles. Like every miracle is unbelievable. Every miracle is a miracle, but when St. Charbel does a miracle, sometimes it's just your eyes pop out.
It's believable. It's believable.
That's right. We still have the living miracle of the shaming woman, and every 22nd of the month in Lebanon, her wounds in her neck open up and bleed again. She was operated on by St. Maroon and St. Charbel, right? Back in 1992, I think it was. 30 odd years ago. Living miracles. God is still present, still among us. Yeah, it's intimate, and we've got to return that intimacy. We were made for intimacy. So let's do it, you know.